We're at the Dorner Telescope Museum. This is a picture of Rudolf Dorner. He's a lifelong amateur telescope aficionado, an observer, a really dedicated observer, and he knew his objects really well. As I said, aficionado of telescopes, he loved telescopes. He was also capable of tinkering with them really effectively. Anyway, he had this idea that he would found a telescope museum to tell the story of the telescope in Canada. That's an impossible task, of course, but thanks to Rudolph's generosity, it's now more possible than it was. I'll show you a few of the exhibits we have. We'll start here. So you think of the telescope, you think of the beginning of the telescope for astronomy, and one name comes to mind, and that name is Galileo Galilei, the philosopher of the Grand Duke of Tuscany. Well, not many of Galileo's telescopes survive. Only a couple of them survive in one objective lens in the Galileo Museum in Florence, appropriately enough. Well, this is a copy of those telescopes and the correct objective lens. And this was made by an amateur maker, Réal Manceau, an amateur telescope maker in Quebec. He was a very good craftsman, and a very interesting guy. We also have here Galileo himself, being as happy as he ever is. Galileo's shopping list. This was discovered not that long ago in the National Archives in Florence, and what's cool about it is, I think just in the period before we have a record of Galileo making his telescopes, there's a shopping list here of tools and materials for optical work. Galileo's moon. It's not a telescope, but this is his pendulum mechanism. So what's the Canadian connection? Well, there's two connections. Perhaps I should say even three. The very fact that it's not, if you're talking about the telescope in a particular country, you're talking about really the particularities of it, but also it's broader than that. It's an international phenomenon. And all the early telescope makers in Canada and users were aware of Galileo. They thought they were standing somehow in that tradition, with this filiation going back to the early 17th century. So, 1646, the first known observation done with an astronomical telescope in Canada, Saint Marie among the Hurons, done by a Jesuit. And there's a recreation of him and his telescope. It's a lunar eclipse. He does his observation, he sends the stuff through letter to Europe, and it goes through the Jesuits and learned networks, and it gets published. It's published by all the big names. Riccioli, Cartier mentioned it, I think it was one of the conduits for this. And most importantly, in France, Pierre Gassendi, the astronomer and philosopher. Gassendi adds important, they all say that the observer in Canada, what was Canada at the time, was a really good observer. But here's the crucial thing. Pierre Gassendi, and there's him right there in the middle. Pierre Gassendi says, Father Bressani used an exceptional telescope. You think for a minute, 1646, it's 4 years after Galileo dies, a research quality telescope is used to gather data in Canada. And that's amazing. And there's a real connection with Galileo, if you like. So we'll just move over to here. So those are refractors. We use refractors today. They're cool. We also use reflectors of various types. Generally speaking, if you're an amateur telescope maker, you're going to start with reflectors. These designs are different, refractors, reflectors. They're all good. They all do different things differently, but they're all necessary. So where do you think of reflectors? You start with Sir Isaac Newton. In the collections of the Royal Society in London, survives the instrument which is probably from Newton's hands. He built, the one that survives is not his first telescope, it's his third, and he built it with the help of a colleague. And any of you who have any knowledge of the history of astronomy are familiar with this. It's one of these icons. You see it from far off, you know. So here's two copies of it. And this is by Vixen, a quality Japanese company. It's a little bigger than the original, but the mechanics work the way Newton's did. This is really smart. It's almost like a universal joint. You can turn it anywhere you like, and it stays. Real Manceau made this. I mentioned him earlier. This is much closer to the size of the original. And Real even reproduced the physical characteristics of the thing. This may have been where the eyepiece was originally located. It's very nice. And there's a copy of one of the drawings. This is in the Royal Society of London. This is a hand-done copy, by the way. This later ended up engraved, a copper engraving in the Transactions of the Royal Society. So, reflectors. There's a great variety of them. There's some early ones over here. These were built by Canadian amateurs, and I'm amazed these survive, because this stuff often doesn't, but this is just fantastic. Start with these. There's a Canadian, well, he's originally from England, but he worked in Canada as a real estate executive. His hobby, he had several hobbies. One was restoring violins, apparently he was very good. He also made telescopes, and he made everything. He ground the mirrors, he did the machining, he did the woodwork, and he didn't sign his instruments. Didn't sign his instruments. But these were published in the main media to communicate information about telescope making. These are columns in Scientific American, and the other is these things. Amateur telescope making. 1920s to, I think, the last time they were printed in the early 80s. So these got published. And there is this telescope. So someone who was a student at UOT bought this telescope, and this dates from the 20s, from the widow of the son of the maker here. And see here, yep. So Joseph Zaglinski in Toronto restored this and donated it. Here's another one. Now, because it's not signed, when we got this, we didn't know who made it. This came with an interesting provenance, and that provenance is that this is from the farmstead of Sir Frederick Banting, one of the co-inventors of insulin, and I think the second Canadian to win the Nobel Prize in medicine. No, this could have been a telescope Banting used. There's some problems with that theory, and one theory is that the latitude this is built for is for some place south of Canada. It could still have been used here, I don't know. How did we discover that this was built by the same guy, Rogers, who built this? Well, I think the same book, Amateur Telescope Making. There's a picture of it right there. Made in Toronto, 1920s. And it's pure chance. Opened up the book and there it was. I'm so grateful these things survive. And reflectors, 1920s, they're still made. This is an interesting one. This was made by an amateur in Montreal around 1980. He made this for David Levy. David Levy was going to go to Arizona. David always wanted to discover comets. Even when he was a kid, like really young, he wanted to discover comets. It's hard to discover a comet in Montreal given the weather. You have much more chance of it in a drier place like Arizona. He went down there, and by God, he discovered comets. It's astonishing. I'll just show you. So every time this telescope has been used to discover more comets visually than any other in Canada. And David has a record for this using this instrument. Every time he discovered one, he had a brass plaque made and had it put on for his comets. It seems unwieldy. I don't know how the hell David did it, but he did it. He used this as an instrument of discovery. And other famous people signed this. And I'm going to point out just one. John Dobson, the man who pioneered this design. You can almost consider this a revival of a Herschel. Well, aspects of William Herschel's sort of alt-azimuth reflectors. John Dobson, important for that. And David knew him. And so did some of the Canadian amateur telescope makers. Let's see. These are later versions of the Dobsonian telescopes. They're smaller, they're more manageable. This one's a lot of people are really attracted by this because of the engineering use of wood. This is done by Normand Fulham in Quebec. Normand's a wonderful person. He's a very good musician. Made his own guitar, beautiful instrument, but he's mostly known for making telescopes. And he started off making these out of wood. He's now making telescopes which are huge. He's making them professionally. And some of them have mirrors which are 50 inches in diameter, which is pretty impressive. Oh, and the other thing I should mention, the optical quality of his telescopes is like really high. It's out of this world. Anyway, thanks very much for being interested in this, and I hope to see you here someday.